Okay, so one of the reasons we're in Washington today is because the marketing industry is on the sort of precipice of a huge amount of regulation, as we know, with the EU's GDPR Act and with California's Consumer Privacy Act unfolding before us, as well as a number of other states doing similar things, obviously. We may be on the brink, I don't think maybe, I think we are on the brink of a blizzard of state-level regulations that together could mean the business will be in a hell of a lot of confusion. So we need to clear that up and keep close to it. That's why we're privileged today to hear from Noah Joshua Phillips, a commissioner in the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Noah is one of 5 commissioners tasked with protecting consumer welfare. Thank the Lord. He's here to talk about what's happening with marketing, consumer, and digital regulation, and what could be before us in terms of the complex landscape that we see before us. We're delighted to have Stuart Ingis, chairman of Venable, coming alongside too. So he's going to join the commissioner for a fireside chat. I will say that there's going to be a one-on-one conversation now, and then we're going to have a panel of industry experts follow that, at which time we'll get into some Q&A accordingly. So hold your questions for that round. But without any delay, let's welcome Commissioner Phillips and Stuart Ingis on stage. Thank you, gentlemen. Good luck. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, I guess, or good afternoon, I should say. Let me give you just 30 more seconds about Commissioner Phillips. Commissioner Phillips joined the FTC, was appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And prior to that, and important, I think, for this discussion, he was a staffer for Senator Cornyn on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and so has really a wealth of experience on both privacy issues, the Congress, the Federal Trade Commission, and kind of Washington in general. Now, one of the great things about a panel like this is when an FTC commissioner speaks, they're speaking not on behalf of the commission, but really their own views. And so we can kind of sneak in their own views, including some of your Hill perspective as we do that. So without kind of further ado, let me dive right in. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a great crowd and very interested. There's a lot of talk in Washington right now about privacy legislation, and it's been kind of simmering for years, but you have lots of industries and policymakers from all sides, both sides of the aisle, actually calling for privacy laws. So let's start with that one. We'll jump into the FTC. But what do you think?
So, Stu, again, thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here to listen. The first thing I learned in 7 years on Capitol Hill is never to prognosticate about what Capitol Hill is going to end up doing. So I'm going to reserve judgment on the question of what we're going to see at the end of the day. But I don't think it's a secret to anyone to say that we are having a national conversation right now about privacy in a way that we haven't had probably since the 1970s. The circumstances are such that we very well may see legislation. You have a lot of really interesting changes that are going on. Changes in the economy and how the market works, the kind of data, the amount of data that are being collected about people, the capability of industry to utilize and monetize that data. So there are changes in the market because of some changes in the market and also some really high-profile privacy events, I'll call them. I think consumer awareness is changing. People are beginning to understand and to learn what is happening to data that they share about themselves. You also see international developments informing this discussion. GDPR is the most famous, but it's by no means the only one. Countries around the world are discussing privacy. A few weeks ago, I was in Chile for the meeting of the APEC Data Privacy Subgroup. And you see countries all from around the Pacific, in Asia, in Latin America, here in North America, talking about, first of all, what kind of privacy regimes are we going to have? But second of all, if we have different privacy regimes, how are they going to interoperate, right? How are data going to be allowed to flow from one country to the next? And if they don't flow, what are the consequences going to be? Because they could be quite bad. So it's a really interesting time. The thing that I've said to Congress as emphatically as I can is that as we have this discussion, as we look out at the US economy and we contemplate substantial regulation that can impact not just the firms in this room, and not just the firms that collect data in the first instance, but really firms across the economy, everything from cars to small websites, you name it. We need to start the discussion in a place where we're thinking about and hopefully getting consensus on at least the problem that we're solving. So a lot of the discussion right now has to do, at least that I hear on Capitol Hill, has to do with sort of what I would call the second order tools. Things like, should we have rulemaking authority? Should we have civil penalty authority? Should there be preemption of state laws? Those are really important discussions, and they're going to help frame what Congress does if it does something. But that's only one question. A more important question to my mind is, what is the underlying liability standard? What is it that we're trying to achieve with this law? What's in, what's out? What can you do? What can't you do? Really important questions that I'm sure a lot of really smart people on the Hill are grappling with right now, but are not as much in the public debate, at least with respect to the policymakers. And they, in turn, to me, raise the most important questions of all, or the most important question of all, and that is, what are we trying to solve? So I'll give you an example. For years, on a bipartisan basis, the Federal Trade Commission has been pushing for new data security authority. Data security, as everybody knows, is a really important thing. Tough nut to crack from a policy perspective, but really important. When you ask a lot of Americans, what does privacy mean to you? What are you worried about in this new economy where all these data are being shared about people? One answer that you get, and according to some surveys, the most important answer that you get is, I'm afraid bad guys are going to get my data. So that's a data security concern. But GDPR isn't necessarily about data security. It addresses other issues. So we can think about, do consumers have enough information? There's a good argument that maybe they don't. Are people adequately empowered, right, over data about them? Not my words, but some would say their data. These are all different problems. It doesn't mean they're inconsistent, but they're different problems we might solve. And my most important hope for Congress is that even if they can't agree yet on the tools for solving or the liability standard for patching the problem, they need at least to agree on the problem they want to solve. Because the scariest thing to me, both as a policymaker today, but also as a former staffer, is the notion that we're developing tools without a goal in mind, that we're designing remedies and we can't yet define the wrongs. We have to do that.
Yeah, it's always so refreshing to hear your views or people who are thoughtful on these commissioners often fit that role given the area of authority that the commission has. So one of the things that the commission has been doing is to step back and holistically look at identifying challenges, benefits, solutions. So I'm going to ask you about two different workshops or series of workshops that the Commission's holding. The first is there's been a series of workshops focused on consumer protection and competition in this next decade, century. Tell us about those hearings, what you all have learned, where you what you're trying to achieve with those workshops.
Sure. So it probably makes sense to start a little bit earlier back and just, especially for folks in the room who are not so familiar with the Federal Trade Commission, situate us as an agency and where the hearings fall in within that. So the FTC is a pretty old agency. I think we're the second oldest of the independent agencies in the US government. We're older than 100 years. We were started by President Wilson. Originally we began as an answer to a lot of concerns that people had about how the antitrust laws were working in really the 1910s. So we started in 1915. That's when we got our antitrust authority. Years later, during the New Deal in the 30s, we became a consumer protection agency as well. So we've got this organic statute, and it allows us to enforce against unfair methods of competition. That's the competition, the antitrust side of the house, and unfair and deceptive acts and practices. That's sort of everything else. That's the consumer protection stuff, and it includes privacy. And since the 30s, over time, Congress has given us new authorities on specific issues. So with respect to privacy, in the 70s, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which governs the credit bureaus, COPPA, which is the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, that's from the 90s. And that's part of why Congress is, I think, in the main looking at us now as if there is new authority. We're going to be the recipients of that authority. But the agency was set up originally, the agency was set up originally, not just to be a law enforcer. It was supposed to be this independent expert agency, and we were given special tools by Congress to look at how the market is working, to look at how industry practices are developing. And we were expected then, and we're still expected now, to do a lot of interaction with kind of the academic community, with the policy community, with the business community, but also with the public, learning about new trends. We do this all the time. There's a lot of this that goes on. But in 1995, we held a real big series of hearings that very much helped guide the agency to deal with a lot of questions that were presented by market practices and by changes in the economy at the time. The hearings that we're doing today, both on the competition side of the House and on the consumer protection side of the House, are meant to address the fact that we are in a very different economy than we had 20 years ago. And there are a lot of big changes going on. There are these superstar firms that everybody is aware of and paying a lot of attention to. As I said before, there are new ways in which consumers are sharing data about themselves, and many new ways in which those data are being used to the benefit of consumers and other market participants. And what we're trying to do with these hearings is take a moment, look all across the board, bring in some of the smartest minds, and get a sense of, do we need to correct course?
So tell me, there's an additional workshop, a 2-day workshop coming up on privacy, just generally speaking, and the Commission has a number of years ago put out a privacy report calling for various things in privacy. If you're in the audience here, you're worried about limitations on responsible use of data to drive great advertising products, to drive advertising, the holy grail of advertising, delivering an advertisement to a consumer about a product that they're interested in at the time they're interested in doing it. How do you think that these hearings are going to play into all of that and then into the broader policy debate on the issue?
I guess the short answer that I'd give is I hope they play positively. I hope we take the time to listen to what the presenters are saying. I hope we also really think carefully about what I was mentioning before, thinking about these questions about privacy in terms of the harms that we perceive. Part of the problem with the privacy debate is that taste for privacy is really heterogeneous, meaning different people care about different things. So I might care more about a bad guy getting data about me. You might think that a very targeted ad is creepy. And people just have really different tastes. And so trying to come up with policy necessitates us recognizing that people have different tastes. To answer your sort of the beginning of your question, I do worry about stifling innovation. I think we've seen a lot of real good coming out of the use of data in the economy. I think there are things that people validly worry about, but I don't think that conversation should ignore all of the good that can be created and all of the market activity. I'll focus on one particular point, and I've said this before. One thing of which I don't want us to lose sight is the effect that new regulation can have on competition. Because especially when a lot of what seems to animate at least some of the punditry around a new privacy law is certain big firms in the market, it would be, I don't know, ironic, maybe worse, that we get a regulation that ends up entrenching them and not fostering the competition that I think everybody wants to see.
So the 4A's has been engaged and helped to initiate an effort that's still in its early stages. I see the head of the 4A's, Marla, over there, but has shown great leadership with her colleagues, with the leadership of some of the other ad trades, to think through what we're describing as a new paradigm, which is a new because it's different from the old paradigm on privacy, which had really just been a lot about transparency and choice. And a lot of the thinking now, I think, goes to some of what you were describing, which is trying to assess what the problem is, but then tackle, this is a bad area, consumers shouldn't be able to choose certain types of practices, or right or wrong. Any kind of reaction to that, or different approaches to the last 20 years of privacy, kind of transparency and choice?
Look, I think it's a great effort. Let me start with that. I think the issue of transparency and choice is very much top of mind for a lot of folks because, well, really for two issues. The first issue that I'd identify is, and I've heard questions from the Hill about this, a lot of them, a lot of people aren't convinced that just offering a link to your privacy policy really informs consumers. I think that's a valid issue to discuss. Are there ways better to accomplish that goal? I think, though, that conversation has to be had in light of a second conversation, and that is, what appetite do consumers have to know? Right? There's a lot that goes on in the world where it isn't efficient for you as a consumer or an individual, even a voter, to get yourself sufficiently up to speed to make the kind of decision that another person may want to make. Maybe I'm voting on a question of tax policy, and I really feel it's my obligation as a citizen to get absolutely down in the weeds on tax policy. But another person might say, hey, I've got a general inkling that I think we ought to distribute more through the tax system, so I'll vote for Democrats. Those are two different ways of approaching a really important question that citizens in America approach all the time, which is how to vote. You cannot know as much about the decision you're making and still be rationally approaching the question. So I think we need to think about, is notice and choice working the way we mean for it to work? I think we need to recognize that not every consumer wants to at least spend the time to know absolutely everything about them. As part of this discussion, I think we also do need to think about other ways. So I think we need to think about context, right? There are certain contexts, to my mind, where when you are allowing your data to be shared, it is sort of implicit in the bargain. I know when I use apps that help me navigate the streets that they're taking data about where I am. It couldn't work otherwise. And if I don't know that, well, that's a little bit on me. So I think—
You probably don't want 4 opt-ins while you're trying to get to the map, right?
I want to look at the road, Stu.
Right.
I want to follow the directions and look at the road.
So let me ask you, I'm going to ask you maybe one more set of privacy kind of competition questions, kind of tying together some of the themes you talked about, and then going to follow that in the remaining, we have 3 or so minutes with a couple of personal questions.
Oh.
Off script a little bit. You'll like them, though. So on the privacy stuff, one of the things, it's always interesting to hear, and it's so rational to hear a policymaker say, before we define solutions, why don't we look through and define the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think you articulated the need to do that. I'm not going to ask you to figure that out or opine on that now, although I think you've teased some of that in your answers. Another thing that, I think as a commissioner at the FTC that you are charged with, I think both under the Federal Trade Commission Act and just in the role in the competition consumer protection issues that you deal with, if you were to step back and speaking again, not as the commission, but as yourself, what is the outcome you want? So not do you want a law, do you not want a law, but what's the outcome that you think when you're looking at the superstar companies, the competitive companies, the use of data competition, what's the outcome that our society in 2019 should be striving for?
So I think fundamentally, my biggest instinct on this, in a sense, is a dodge to your question, but I think it's really important. I want Congress to make the decisions. I want Congress to sit there and say, this is the world that we want. What I want to inform that decision, I want us to capture as many of the benefits as we can of the data sharing that we see. I want us to continue to foster competition. And I want us to decide through the democratic process, what are the things we don't like so much, and do our best on a targeted basis to address those. Here's what I don't want. I don't want to decide. I don't think it is my role as a Federal Trade Commissioner or our role as an expert agency to make the fundamental value judgments, the fundamental democratic choices about which harms we need to address. We shouldn't create rights. So to me, the most important thing is actually that the people who are elected, who are answerable to the people, answer the fundamental questions you're asking.
So I'm going to throw you a softball before the personal question.
Those are always good.
That was a great answer. But again, you have a crowd here, several hundred people that are worried about how these types of laws could impact their business. Are you confident that that process is going to get it right?
Let me just say that I'm hopeful, right?
I thought you'd say yes, but yeah, you worked on the Hill. It's a tough time. So let me ask you. So people, I think you have a great job. It's cool, right? It's like my shoes.
I think so too.
Like my shoes, right? It's
like
cool.
my socks.
Give the audience just a little bit of a sense of what it's like to get nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Like, just give them a little flavor, because, we're all people. We all, have had careers, but, give them a sense of the fun of doing that. Or the lack of fun.
It's exhilarating. It's a little bit scary, I think. It's a level of scrutiny that one doesn't often encounter. You have to write a lot of things down on paper, and those papers are up for the world to see. But it's incredibly humbling, fundamentally. It's really humbling that the president would nominate me and my colleagues. It's really humbling that all of us managed to get through the Senate unanimously. That takes a lot. I used to be one of those people who worked really hard on trying to move nominations through the Senate. So it's fundamentally, it's just incredibly humbling.
You enjoying the job?
Incredibly.
Great. Well, I think you can all agree with me that we are going to get it right when you have a commissioner thoughtful as Commissioner Phillips is. And please join me in thanking him for taking time of his busy day to share a few minutes with us.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you so much.